Hey everyone, this is Eric with EPB Macro Research, and in this video, I'm going to do a quick breakdown about why demographics matter so much for economic analysis. Demographic trends are incredibly powerful when analyzing long-term trends in economic growth, inflation, and by association, trends in interest rates and other asset prices. When talking about demographics, what do we really mean? The discussion of demographics usually centers around two main factors: the growth rate of the population and the composition or age structure of the population. The economic process at EPB Macro Research involves careful study of secular or long-term economic trends, factors that influence growth and inflation over 3 to 5 years or longer, and cyclical economic trends, or the shorter-term fluctuations in growth over the 6 to 18-month window. Demographics are a very long-term variable, so we're only talking about how demographics impact the secular or long-term economic trends. Demographics are not predictive over the short term and shouldn't be used when discussing the 1-year or even 2-year time horizon. When we look out over 5 years or over 10 years, the famous saying is that demographics is destiny. So let's dive in and understand why demographics matter so much for the long-term analysis and can be the most predictive variable. To start, we have to look at total population growth. Economic growth is a function of population and productivity, or how many people are working and how productive are those people. When population growth declines or turns negative, that means there are less people. So unless you have a major surge in productivity, economic growth is pulled down. The 2021 census showed that population growth in the United States fell to the lowest level in more than 120 years. More so than total population, what we really want to know is the labor force growth, because these are the people that are working and actually contribute the most to economic output. It's not a shock that population growth and labor force growth are tied at the hip. And in the United States, according to the UN projections, the growth rate of the 25 to 64-year-old cohort, the segment that makes up the lion's share of the labor force, is going to trend lower and close to 0% over the next decade. If we look at the long-term or 10-year growth rate of the labor force, we can see that it is tied to the long-term trend in nominal GDP growth. Not every quarter or every year, but over 5 to 10 years, the growth rate in the population, and thus the growth rate in the labor force, is like gravity on total economic growth. The long-term trends in the labor force are also closely tied to long-term trends in inflation. Again, not every quarter or every year, but over a decade, if the population growth is declining, and thus the labor force growth is declining, then excess capacity is exposed in the economy, which pulls down the rate of inflation. Right now, we're talking about the growth rate of the population, but some people think that an aging population is inflationary, even though that has never really been proven in any economy of the world, but I'll make a separate video on that entirely. Yes, there are some pro-inflationary forces to an aging population, but the disinflationary forces, or the forces that pull down economic growth that I'll explain in this video, massively outweigh those pro-inflationary forces. Since the growth rate in the labor force or the working age population is tied to nominal economic growth, and nominal growth drives trends in interest rates, then we can use long-term demographic trends to understand the future direction of interest rates. The long-term trend in the labor force is tied to the federal funds rate or short-term interest rates. If labor force growth is declining and the economy is getting weaker as a result, then the economy needs lower interest rates. It can't handle or sustain higher interest rates. The same thing is true with long-term interest rates. We see that the long-term trend in the labor force growth is tied to the trending direction of long-term interest rates. So if we know that labor force growth is going to fall in the future, then it's going to be very hard for the economy to sustain higher interest rates. Can rates go up in any given year or any given 2 years? Of course. We've seen that happen a handful of times since 2009, but it just can't be sustained given the demographic gravity pulling economic growth down. So we know that the growth rate of the population and the growth rate of the labor force impacts aggregate economic growth, but what about the age composition? The average rate of consumption follows a very predictable pattern based on age. From 25 to 54, average consumption increases, and as you age, you tend to consume less on average. So an economy wants a super high growth rate of people aged 25 to 64, moving upwards in their consumption patterns, consuming more each and every year. As you age and you start to consume less, then the economy needs to produce less, and you need less production, less labor, and that reveals excess capacity in the economy. The US economy had vibrant growth from the 1970s through the early 2000s for several reasons, but one of the major reasons is that the prime age cohort, the best cohort for growth, the 25 to 64-year-olds, were becoming a larger and larger share of the population. The US had more people moving upwards in their consumption pattern than people moving downwards. After the mid-2000s, this flipped, and the share of this high consumption cohort started to decline, so there were more people moving down the backside of their consumption curve, and this is one of the major reasons why the post-financial crisis period had some of the weakest economic growth that we've seen in modern history. Even more importantly, as I outlined in the last video on this channel, housing and durable goods, or housing and vehicles consumption, are the engine of economic growth, and this consumption peaks even earlier, in the 35 to 54-year-old bracket. So an economy really wants massive growth in the 25 to 44 or even the 25 to 54-year-old bracket. While the growth rate of the 25 to 54-year-old cohort is positive in the United States, it is dwarfed by the growth rate of the older population. So again, more people are moving down the consumption curve for these high-powered goods compared to people moving up the consumption curve. This analysis has been proven out many times and demonstrated by this chart, which shows that younger people are a drag on economic growth and older people are a drag on economic growth. The prime age population is the segment that drives economic activity. So if the share of the population that is 25 to 54 is shrinking, which it is, then you're going to have more people that are acting as a negative force on the economy than a positive force on the economy. Many people say that the millennials are bigger than the boomers, but the facts show that the relative share of the prime age cohort is shrinking. So yes, the millennials will be a positive force on the economy, but it will be overwhelmed by the negative force of the 65 and over crowd. Also, the millennials have a lot of debt, but that's a topic for another video. If we look around the world, it's not all bad news for the United States because basically everywhere else is worse off. This chart is really informative because it highlights that when the working age population growth flips negative, an economy is basically doomed. Working age population growth in Japan flipped negative in the early 1990s, and they had to go to negative interest rates, quantitative easing, and they've never been able to stop even today. The economy is just too weak. After 2009, the working age population in Europe flipped negative, and they went to negative interest rates, quantitative easing, and they haven't been able to stop. Even now, as the United States is raising interest rates to combat inflation, Europe is falling apart trying to catch up and has already abandoned most of their tightening plans. In 2015, China's working age population flipped negative, and they've had problems ever since. They devalued their currency in 2015 and tried once more to inflate a property bubble, but it didn't work, and now they're having to manage the deflation of an asset bubble that the population can't support. The US is in better shape than the other major economies of the world like Japan, Europe, and China, but we're not really looking at robust levels of growth in this prime age population. The other thing to look at in terms of demographics is called the age dependency ratio. The age dependency ratio measures the ratio of young and old people relative to the working age population, and it's used to judge the burden placed on the working age population to support the young and old by diverting time to care for them and also resources to care for them. The ratio in this chart is inverted, so when the line is moving lower, the working age population has a larger burden from the young and the old, and in the case of the United States, Japan, Europe, and China, the burden is from the older population, not as much from the younger population. The dependency ratio is becoming more burdensome in the United States, sharply more burdensome in Europe, and off the charts in Japan. This has huge ramifications for taxes and debt because in modern societies, older people have forms of Social Security, healthcare, and pensions that all need to be supported either through taxation or debt. This drains resources from the prime age population that needs to drive the economy. Most economies don't want to tax the prime age population that hard because it's obvious that that's bad for economic growth. So most countries have decided to use massive increases in debt to support the older population, placing the same burden on the working age population anyway. These two factors, worsening demographics and increased debt burdens, are why the real growth rate in most developed nations is collapsing. In the United States, as a result of the demographic trends I just outlined, plus a rising debt burden, real GDP per capita can barely sustain 1% increases over the long run, compared to 2.5% in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So to summarize, demographics are extremely important for long-term economic analysis, and it impacts growth, it impacts inflation, interest rates, and asset prices more broadly. Lower population growth means lower labor force growth, and older demographics means less consumption and, more importantly, less high-powered consumption. And these two things really impact growth negatively. This is why demographics matter so much for long-term economic analysis. Please let me know if you found this video helpful and what you'd like to see next, and I will see you in the next video.